Romans 11, verse 22 says, "Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fail, severity, but toward you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off." Tonight we'll be seeing the goodness and the severity of God. And the two different lessons really that we have here, one on Josiah and one on Nahum and his prophecy against Nineveh. Good to see everybody out tonight. If you have any questions or comments, please speak up. We've got a lot of material, so we'll just get right on into it. As you can see, we're going to be talking about the book of the law being found, and we'll be talking about Nahum. This is lesson 17. Lesson 14, Jeff brought us the first part about Josiah, and this has probably been a couple of weeks ago. And we know that he was a good king, and he was kind of after the mold of Asa and Hezekiah. He tried to do whatever God had told him to do. And he walked in the ways of his father David. We know that when he was 16 years old, he started seeking after God. In his 12th year, he started purging Judah and the surrounding area of the idols and such. But it wasn't just Judah and Jerusalem. He went on into what was the northern kingdom before, and he started clearing out things from there. And when you consider how good a king that Josiah was, this first section really stands out to me when we think about what he didn't have at his disposal at the beginning. We'll talk about the book of the law being found. It was the 18th year of Josiah's reign. And you'll remember from Sunday, Jeff talked about how in the 13th year of Josiah's reign, Jeremiah started prophesying. So we're at least 5 years into Jeremiah's prophecies. And Josiah is 18th year. He's about 26 years old. They've been taking up money. The doorkeepers have, the Levites have, and it wasn't just the people from Jerusalem and Judah. It was people throughout Israel. Well, used to be Israel. And Josiah sends some messengers over to Hilkiah the high priest. Shaphan the scribe was one of those messengers. And he says, use this money to fix up the temple. Use it to pay the workers. Use it to pay the craftsmen. Use it to buy hewn stone. Use it to buy timber to go in the roof and to go in the floors. Use it to fix up the temple. At this point, the temple is what, about 400 years old? Something like that? And yes, Judah has had several good kings, but it's also had quite a few bad kings when we think about it. Ahaz and Ammon and the early years of Manasseh, and how they trashed up the temple. And also, even some of the good kings, when they had people who come up against them from other nations, what would they do? They'd go to the temple and strip it of the gold. Remember when Ahaz wanted Assyria to go up to fight against Damascus. What did he do? He took some of the gold out of the temple. And when Assyria came up against Hezekiah, what did he do? He stripped the doors of the gold. He stripped the pillars of the gold. So you can imagine that the temple has been neglected for quite some time. And so Josiah wants to get it built back up again. So he sends these people over there to Hilkiah the high priest. And as Jeff mentioned on Sunday, Hilkiah may have been the father of Jeremiah the prophet. So he goes over there, and while he's over there, Hilkiah says to Shaphan, I have found the book of the law. Every time I read this passage, it's just amazing to me. I have found the book of the law. Where was it? It was in the temple. Mr. Waldron suggests, of course, nobody knows where it was exactly or why it was hidden all this time, but he suggests that maybe this was, part of the Pentateuch, those first five books of the law. and that Moses had made a copy of it and given it to the priest, and it was supposed to have been set beside the Ark of the Covenant. But who knows what had happened during that 400 years? Had it been gone for a long time? Had Hezekiah had access to it? I don't know the answer to that. But I do know from the way that Josiah reacts to it in just a minute that he hadn't seen it. He hadn't had access to it. And that, to me, just really says leaps and bounds about who Josiah was. When Shaphan the scribe was given this book, he read it. And then he goes back to Josiah and he gives him a report. He gives him a report on what the work that's being done inside of the temple, the money, how it's being used, the work that's being done. And he says, Hilkiah found this book. And he reads it to Josiah. And he has an immediate, tremendous reaction on Josiah. He tears his clothes. And he sends this delegation of people, Hilkiah the high priest and Shaphan the scribe and some other people. He says, inquire of the Lord concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is aroused against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of the book to do according to all that is written concerning us. He tears his clothes. He hasn't heard these words before. We talk about how good Josiah is. How did he know to do the things that he was doing? He had some knowledge, but he was gaining some more knowledge. And he was fearful for himself and for Judah at this point. And so he sends to inquire of the Lord. And so they do that. They go to hold of the prophetess. And that's interesting to me too, because couldn't Hilkiah, being the high priest, have inquired of the Lord himself? Apparently not. If Hilkiah is the father of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's been prophesying for at least 5 years now, couldn't he have just went to Jeremiah? I don't know the reason they went to Huldah, but Huldah has the message from God. And I'm sure it's the message that Josiah was fearing. God said he was going to bring calamity on this place and on its inhabitants. And he was going to bring all the curses that were written in the book. Y'all remember back in Deuteronomy when Moses told the people, when you go into the land, you get up on Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and you pronounce the blessings and the curses that are written in the book. I take it that he was reading some of these same curses, and God was going to bring them on them because they had not followed after what God had told them to do. And he tells them why he was going to do that. They had forsaken him. They had burned incense to other gods. They had provoked God to anger with all the works of their hands. And then it says, therefore my wrath will be poured out on this place and will not be quenched. It's scary. God is very angry at Judah. I highlighted where in the Bible it says, you've provoked me to anger. And if you do a phrase search, at least in the New King James Version, I found 15 different passages. I think they were all in the Old Testament where it said, provoked me to anger. And if you make it past tense, provoked me to anger, I think there were another 3 or 4 more. And in quite a few of them, maybe not all of them, but in quite a few of them, it always had to do with worshiping the works of their hands, worshiping idols. That provoked God to anger. And he had warned everybody about that way back when. In Exodus chapter 20. Let's read a few verses there. Exodus chapter 20. We'll read verses 4 through 6. You'll remember this is the chapter where Moses receives the 10 commandments. And for some of those commandments, in this particular passage, God doesn't go into a lot of detail here. Of course, throughout he goes into more detail. But in this particular passage, for instance, in verse 13, you shall not murder. He doesn't go into a lot of detail about you shall not murder. And in verse 14, he says you shall not commit adultery. He doesn't go into a lot of detail about that. But there's a couple of things in these verses that he does go into detail in. And one of them is worshiping idols. Go with me back to verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Who was it that God said hated him? Well, in this particular passage, he's talking about people who made images and bowed down to them. And we know how the northern kingdom did that forever, and they were taken away. And Judah and Jerusalem, they had been doing that. Even with the good kings, they had been doing that. And God was going to take them away. Questions or comments about that? God was going to be good to Josiah, though. He said Josiah would go to his grave in peace. And Josiah would not see all the calamity which I bring on this place and its inhabitants. Kind of reminds me of you remember when Hezekiah was sick, about the 14th year of his reign. He had been sick. He got better, obviously, because God made him well. But the people from Babylon sent an envoy over there, and they brought gifts to him because they had heard that he had been sick. And his pride lifted him up, and he showed them everything in his kingdom. And remember, Isaiah came to Hezekiah and said, Israel is going to be taken captive. They're going to be slaves of these people from Babylon. And even your descendants, they're going to be eunuchs in these people's courts. And what was Hezekiah's response to that? The words that you say are good. At least there will be peace in my time. And at least there was going to be peace in Josiah's time. But we'll see further on, and Jeff will get into this on Sunday, how it seems like that just encouraged Josiah to work harder to follow after God. Why was God going to be good to Josiah? Because Josiah was humble. Because he tore his clothes. Because he wept at the Lord's words. When was the last time I wept? Because I read the word of the Lord and I saw what it meant about me. He wept before the Lord. And God said, I have heard you. God knew that Josiah trusted in him and that he had humbled himself before him. And if we'll do the same, God will know that also, won't he? Questions or comments about that? Okay. Nahum. When I first saw that I was going to be teaching Nahum, and I saw, hey, this is a short prophet. We've been doing prophets a whole lot this quarter. They've all been saying the same thing. I got 5 minutes worth of material here. Wow, Nahum is such a rich book. I have not been giving it the thought that it deserves. If you have not read Nahum lately, read it, and then read it again. And then find another translation of the Bible and read it again. It is so powerful. And I saw several places where people referred to it as being the sequel to Jonah. Where was it that God sent Jonah to? That Jonah didn't want to go? Nineveh. He didn't want to go to Nineveh, but God sent him there. And what was the lesson? What was the message that Jonah had for Nineveh? Yeah, God's going to destroy you. And one last question about that. What was their response? to that message that Jonah gave. They repented. Even the king, he got in sackcloth and he told everybody, you get rid of all the evil that's in your hands, and maybe God will relent from this destruction that he's about to bring on us. That was Nineveh 150 years earlier. They've changed considerably since then. Back then, they respected God. They feared God. They feared what God would do to them. But that has changed considerably since that time. In the first chapter, we'll see God describing himself. And he'll also tell Judah that they're going to be delivered from Assyria. And he tells Nineveh that they're toast. They're done. They're not going to be around much longer. And in chapters 2 and 3, he goes into more detail about how that's going to occur. We don't know a whole lot about who Nahum was. He was an Elkoshite. Don't know where that was. Don't know how old he was. Don't know exactly what years it was that he was prophesying. We can get kind of a 50, 51 year range there that we can know that he prophesied during those times, because in chapter 3 and in verse 8, he mentions the destruction of Thebes, or no, Ammon, I think is the words that he uses there, but Thebes. And it was destroyed by the Assyrians in 663 BC. And in the book, he talks about the future destruction of Nineveh, and that happens in 612 BC. So there's about a 50-year period there. Could have been during the time of Manasseh, could have been during the time of Ammon, could have been during the time of Josiah. All three, I don't know. Now, what was the message? The burden, the prophecy, the pronouncement against Nineveh. And the key word there is against. Because that's what we see throughout this whole book, as God is against Nineveh. He mentions how Nineveh had been against him, but he is against Nineveh. How would you describe God? Any words or phrases that you would use to describe God? What are some of the first things that come to your mind? Sir? Avenge. Okay. He takes vengeance. That's good. Merciful. Okay. Jealous. All-knowing and almighty. All-knowing and almighty. I think a lot of the time, I can't speak for everybody, but I'll just speak for myself. A lot of the time, maybe it's because of what I want to think about. I think about God as love, and surely he is. And I think that's maybe what the bulk of people who have any knowledge of God or acceptance of God would say. God's love. And we're very thankful that he is. And as was mentioned, a lot of times we think about how merciful God is and how gracious and how kind and patient. And again, how thankful are we for that? And we should be. But that's not the thing you see so much in this book. This book brings out the justice of God, and it was mentioned as the vengeance of God. We'll see a lot of that in this book. In Exodus chapter 3, God described himself as, I am who I am, when he sent Moses back to Egypt. And a little bit later, Pharaoh says to Moses, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. So he said, I don't know who he is. But of course, we know the rest of that story, and he found out a little bit about who God is, didn't he? And he let Israel go. Sunday, Jeff talked about in Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 12 through 13, there are some verses there where God describes himself as being the creator, and that he is kind, and that he's over all the earth. We can find lots of passages. I think, where God describes who He is. But in chapter 1 of Nahum, we'll really see it. Remember when Sennacherib came up against Judah? And he was going against all those cities of Judah, and he was wiping them out. And the first real place that we know that he came to was Lachish, and he sends messengers over to Hezekiah. And then he goes on a little further, and he's fighting against the Ethiopians, and he sends more messengers to Hezekiah. And what was the message that he sends to the people? About God. Basically, the same message in both of those times. He says, don't listen to Hezekiah, lest he persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations of all delivered its land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim and Hena and Iva? Indeed, have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their countries from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? 150 years ago, during the time of Jonah, they had fear of God. They trembled before Him. They had respect. Now, during Hezekiah's time, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, had no respect for God. He's just another idol. He's just like the gods of all these other nations. God's going to show him different. Be turning, if you would, to Nahum chapter 1, and we'll be reading the first 11 verses. Nahum chapter 1, and we'll read the first 11 verses. In these verses, he's telling Nineveh, this is who you're dealing with. The burden against Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. God is jealous, and the Lord avenges. The Lord avenges and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on His adversaries, and He reserves wrath for His enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord has His way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of His feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the flower of Lebanon wilts. The mountains quake before Him, the hills melt, and the earth heaves at His presence. Yes, the world and all who dwell in it. Who can stand before His indignation? And who can endure the fierceness of His anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by Him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and He knows those who trust in Him. But with an overflowing flood, He will make an utter end of its place, and darkness will pursue His enemies. What do you conspire against the Lord? He will make an utter end of it. Affliction will not rise up a second time. For while tangled like thorns and while drunken like drunkards, they shall be devoured like stubble fully dried. From you comes forth one who plots evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor. I kind of divided up these verses into three groups. God the avenger. God is the avenger. Another is God is good. And another is God is great.
Do you not see what's happening in this world? Do you not see everything we've lost?
God said He
we had all of these things and now it's gone. Why are you still praising God? We've lost all of these things. Curse Him and die. Why do you still have your integrity? Go against God. He's obviously not with us anymore.
He's wrathful. He's furious. He is so mad at these people, these Ninevites. He is going to destroy them. He can do that to me too. God will not at all acquit the wicked. He's not going to call good evil or call evil good. He's going to sit in judgment of it. He has fierce anger. And He is going to make an utter end of those who conspire against Him. He said, I'll make an end of them. It won't take a second time. The first time I do it. This passage is so very powerful and brings out a side of God that I don't think we think of, or at least I don't think of very often, with the wrath and the jealousy and the fierceness and the... It's good to think about that side too. Yes, sir.
When we think about that, sometimes we can be lured into a mistake of looking at it in our terms. You know, we can be wrathful and vengeful because we're vindictive. God isn't, it's not that he's vindictive, it's that his holy nature demands wrath and vengeance against those who sin, because God cannot go through sin. He's going to wipe out sin and those who perpetuate it. You know, that same strength is used to give blessings to those who repent and strive to obey God.
Thank you. That's a good comment. Tony was just saying that sometimes we're wrathful or vengeful, sometimes because of our own petty ways, but God just cannot stand sin, cannot put up with sin. And so his wrath is against sin, and as Tony said, those who perpetuate it. Good comment. Yes, sir.
It brings to mind in Genesis, the 6th chapter, about where God says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." And he talks about how the thought, so that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then we have the flood.
Very good. Greg mentioned that Genesis chapter 6, where the thought of men's heart was on evil continually, and then there was the flood. Basilio?
Sometimes we have a battle with ourselves, with our feelings. In many of our Latin countries, Venezuela, Haiti, Bolivia, and many other countries, Nicaragua, there are a lot of injustice going on. My country, Mexico, justice, also corruption. We wonder how much more it will require for God to act. At the same time, we think about people that are still trying to do what is right, and that's what our feelings are sometimes, and we keep asking God to give His mercy, love upon us, because things are in our vision, they're not a good way, but God will know when He will respond in your life. He will do it. It's different.
Very good. And Basilio was talking about sometimes when there's injustices against us, we wonder how long God is going to put up with that. His comments remind me of Jonah. Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. He wanted God to take care of Nineveh then, but it wasn't time. It wasn't time because God said it wasn't time. Now it's time. Okay, good comments. Thank you. Okay, God mentions that He is good. And He knows those who trust Him. We talked about how He knew that Josiah trusted in Him earlier. And it says that God is a stronghold during trouble. And who is it that we turn to in our times of trouble? Isn't it God? Because there's nobody else who can help us like God. And hopefully God can see us the same way that He saw Josiah, that we trust in Him. And then thirdly, in these verses, we see God is powerful. And I lumped this into kind of subgroups. God is in control. God is in control of the skies. He says He has His way over the whirlwind and the storms, and the clouds are the dust of His feet. And God controls the bodies of water. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up the rivers, as mentioned in those verses. Kind of reminds you of the time when Jesus was in the boat with His disciples out on the Sea of Galilee, I think it was. And the big storm came up, and His disciples woke Him up, and He rebuked it and said, "Peace, be still." And it was still. And His disciples said, "Who can this be?" Well, He was God and is God. And that's the God that we worship. And that's the God that He was trying to present to the Ninevites. so they could see that. He's in charge. He's in control of the skies and the bodies of water. He's in control of the lands. He mentions Bashan and Carmel there, the different areas that they wither and the flower of Lebanon wilts. And he controls the hills and the mountains. The mountains quake before him and the hills melt before him. I watch a lot of old Westerns, black and white Westerns. And you ever see some of those Westerns where people are just shaking in their boots because somebody is coming to town? That's kind of the picture I get from this. The mountains are in fear of the Lord. They respect the Lord. They're in awe of the Lord, as we should be. They quake in God's presence. God is in control of everything. The earth heaves, burns, trembles, as other versions would say, at His presence. And it says, yes, the Lord and all who dwell in it. And again, He's in control of all of us. And we should be just like those mountains and quake before Him. Yes, we love Him. Yes, we cannot show Him the amount of love that He deserves. But we also should have an immense fear and respect for who He is. Okay, questions or comments about that? He says to Judah, Nineveh is strong and numerous, but I'm going to mow them down. The phrases that God uses in this book, the strong phrases to talk about Himself, the strong phrases He uses to say how He's going to destroy Nineveh, and the strong words that He uses in reference to Nineveh itself. He tells Nineveh they're done. They're not going to have any more children. He's going to eliminate their idols. And in chapter 1 and verse 14, using the CSB, he says, I will prepare your grave, for you were contemptible. Contemptible. I would hate for the Lord to think that of me. In chapters 2 and 3, we read more about the destruction of Nineveh. We get into more details there. In chapter 2, I want to read verse 1. Nahum chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, He who scatters has come up before your face. Man the fort, watch the road, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily. The one who scatters. And we see throughout the rest of this book that the people of Nineveh were going to be scattered. Those who didn't fall dead in the city. And it sounds like most of them did fall dead in the city. It says it's going to be full of corpses. But God says the one who scatters has come up against you. The burden against Nineveh. The one who scatters has come up against you. Several times we see that He's against Nineveh. And whether He's talking about Himself here or He's talking about the combined armies of the Babylonians and the Medes and the Scythians that come up against Nineveh later, either way, it's God who's doing the scattering. And He's going to scatter them. Nineveh is going to be plundered. Several places I've read said that the siege against Nineveh lasted for 3 months. I read at least one place that said that the plundering of Nineveh went on for a whole month. Can you imagine? The plundering took a whole month. All the gold and the silver and everything else that they had there, taking it down, taking it apart, taking it home with them. In verse 10 of chapter 2, in the New King James, it says, Nineveh is empty, desolate, and waste. The CSB says desolation, decimation, devastation. The utter destruction of Nineveh. In chapter 2, God does mock Nineveh. He goes into talking to Nineveh and saying, you feel like you're like lions, that you're so powerful. And you go into all these other nations and you take them as prey. And you take them home to your cubs, as it were, and to your lion family. And you give them all this booty that you have taken up. And He says, it's not going to happen anymore. Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall be heard no more. To the people of Judah who heard this, to those who still believed in God and still believed in his power, what a wonderful book. Assyria had been a thorn in their side for how long? To the people of Nineveh, if there were any there who believed in God at all, how scary it must have been. He said Nineveh would be full of corpses in verses 2 through 4 in chapter 3. And again, he mentions that Nineveh is ready to fall and the people will flee. In the last couple of verses in chapter 3, God says, Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Your nobles rest in the dust. Your people are scattered in the mountains, and no one gathers them. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is severe, and who will hear news of you? All who hear news of you will clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually? I take it that those first couple of lines there about the shepherds and the nobles resting in the dust is going back to all the corpses that were going to be in the city. And he says, your injury has no healing. You're not going to come back from this. You're done. And the people who hear about you in the surrounding nations, they're going to clap their hands because Assyria had been so mean and wicked to all the nations around them. They're going to be happy. Questions or comments about that?
Very similar to the punishment of God bringing the first century to Rome. Very similar.
A corresponding destruction of Rome that we read about. Very good. I'm just going to make one other comment. When we look at Nahum, we may think these are a lot of generalizations that are written about the destruction of Nineveh. But there's a lot of things that you can read that are just facts that you see from history. And I'll just read about one. In chapter 3 and verse 13, it talks about the fire shall devour the bars of your gates. And down the quote that I have is from a book that talks about the excavation, the archaeological work that was begun in Nineveh when it was found again in the 1800s. 2,400 years later, it was lost for that long. The book said, talking about the throne room in Nineveh, the intense heat that caused the south wall to bend inward and the floor of the chamber itself was buried upon a great pile of burnt debris over 1.5 meters in depth. Never have I seen so perfect an example of vengeful bonfire. God executed his wrath and his vengeance on them. I appreciate y'all's help tonight. Lord willing, Jeff will be teaching us about the covenant being renewed with Jehovah on Sunday morning. Thank you again.
Good evening. I'd like to speak for a few minutes tonight on the topic of commitment. Commitment is defined as the state or quality of being dedicated to something. I'm going to start with I guess you could call it a diatribe about a fairly trivial misuse of the term commitment. And I used to follow college football recruiting and always found it amusing when you would hear a high school senior, make a commitment to a particular college, and then you'd see he was still going to go visit 4 more schools before making his final decision. So when he made this announcement, how committed was he to the school that he announced his commitment for? And those of you who still follow college sports know that it's kind of getting very little loyalty or commitment from players to schools anymore. It's more about chasing money and see how much they can get paid instead of being loyal to a school. So that's kind of an example of either, however you want to look at it, either an insincere commitment or not following through on a commitment. But to look at some other commitments that we can all probably relate to. Today happens to be 20 years to the day that I got married. So 20 years ago today, I made a commitment to Erin, and that's working out pretty well so far. Marriage is one of the bigger physical commitments that we make as human beings, and it's a commitment on both the part of the man and the woman to fulfill their marriage vows to being together from death do us part, and takes commitment to our God-given responsibilities as husbands and wives to make the marriage the best it can be, and mainly to follow the command to just love one another. And if you love one another, then a lot of times the rest of it will take care of itself. Another earthly example would be of a commitment is if you need money, you go to a bank, you sign an agreement for a loan. Well, at that point, you're committed to paying that loan back. Otherwise, the bank's going to come take your car or foreclose on your house. When you take a job, you're committing to do a service for a particular wage, and if you don't fulfill that commitment, they're probably going to replace you with somebody that will. Most importantly, for us, being a child of God is the most important commitment that we'll be a part of. Just for a minute, I'd like to look at the difficulty or lack of difficulty to fulfill some commitments, and kind of have a reason for going through this. But not all of these are going to be black and white, and not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's more of a kind of a thinking exercise. But so let's look at if you're on a sports team or a fan of a team. How hard is it to fulfill your commitment to show up for your ball games, or as a committed fan, show up at your TV on Saturday afternoon? That's pretty easy for most of us that like that sort of thing, because let's face it, we value fun and entertainment and competition. A more serious one is we do have a responsibility, commitment to take care of our family. And in this example, I'm really just speaking basic needs: food, clothing, and shelter. That's not too difficult for most of us to fulfill. It could be, depending on certain circumstances that people run into. And then again, marriage, is it difficult to follow through on loving your spouse? I hope that's an easy one for us. One that might be a little more difficult, but it is a great example of commitment from a physical standpoint. If someone is interested in getting healthy or losing weight, especially when you get over 30 or 40, it's hard, but mainly it's hard to stay committed. It takes diligence and commitment, whether that's eating right or exercising. I don't know, I mean, how many times in my life I've started lifting weights and I do great for 2 weeks, and then that's just not really my thing. So I've always had a hard time committing to that particular. But commitment to following God and His Word, is that an easy commitment or is it difficult? We'll touch on that again at the end. But following up on just our commitment to God in general, I want to quickly look at a couple of examples from the Bible. I could use Job, but Lee covered him Sunday, did a good job talking about how he stayed committed through his very adverse circumstances. We could talk about Daniel or Elijah the prophet, but I'm just going to quickly hit on the one Old Testament, one New Testament character. Joseph. He went through a lot in his life. He was sold by his brothers as a young boy. Then he gets to Potiphar's house, and his wife chases him, and he has to resist that temptation, and he winds up in jail. And just in Egypt, and politically, he moves way up the ranks, and he could have let that power go to his head, and all that time he continued to serve God and fulfill his commitment to obey God. And even when his brothers showed up, he forgave them. He didn't take vengeance on them. And Hebrews 11 mentions where he in his deathbed he reminds them of the promise that they were going to leave the land of Egypt, that he made them promise to carry his bones to Israel when they got out of Egypt. So a good example of remaining committed to the Lord through all sorts of various circumstances. And the other example will be a little different. Paul, I won't try to go through any narrative, but instead I would rather share a few scriptures from Paul that speak to his commitment through all sorts of circumstances, and then some of his edifications to actually Timothy in particular. I'm going to stick with Timothy about remaining committed. The first one is 1 Timothy 4:15 and 16. Meditate on these things, give yourself entirely to them, that your progress may be evident to all. Take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them, for doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you. 2 Timothy 4:17 says, "But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that all the Gentiles might hear. Also, I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion, and the Lord will deliver me from every evil work and preserve me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever." I won't read this one. We all know it. 2 Timothy 2:15 says to be diligent, which is a trait of one who is committed. 2 Timothy 1 verse 12 says, "For this reason I suffer these things. Nevertheless I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day." And 2 Timothy 4 verse 7 says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." So Paul stayed committed throughout all his days, and all the things that he endured, from persecutions and jail and shipwrecks and being stoned nearly to death, and all that. He remained faithful to the Lord. And very quickly, don't try to turn to these, but a couple of other passages. Deuteronomy 6:5 says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." I read that one because if you follow that command, it's going to be a lot easier to be committed to the Lord if you love him like we're commanded to. Solomon, when dedicating the temple, said, "Let your heart therefore be loyal," some versions say, "or committed to the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments." Psalm 37:5, "Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass." Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not become weary in doing good." And in Luke 9:62, Jesus says, "No one who puts a hand on to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." We as Christians have a commitment to follow God. How are we doing with that? Are we committed to Him as we should be? And when I was talking about how difficult or easy it is to follow through on commitments, I wanted us to think for a second about, if it is hard to stay committed to the Lord, why is that the case? Is it because of the cost that Jeff talked about the other day? If so, that may be a family situation, something that's not inherently wrong. Jesus said it would have a cost, and it will. But what if it's more that due to a lack of faith or belief, or similar to the rich man, it's just your priorities are out of order and you're more worried about wealth or whatever it could be that is keeping you from being fully committed. But if you haven't started a commitment to the Lord, you have an opportunity tonight by being baptized. And if you're already a Christian and need the prayers of the church for forgiveness, or just make that known by coming forward as we stand and sing.